On a routine flight from Singapore to Perth, the primary flight computers of Qantas Flight 72 began to malfunction, causing the aircraft to unexpectedly pitch downward towards the Indian Ocean. With more than 300 passengers on board, the aircraft abruptly found itself in a deadly nosedive. Violent negative G-forces sent anything and anyone not secured crashing toward the cabin ceiling, resulting in more than 100 injuries, including spinal injuries and broken bones. This is a harrowing story where Captain Sullivan, relying on his elite military training, attempts to regain control of the aircraft. Will his efforts succeed, or will the flight tragically end in the Indian Ocean? This is the story of Qantas Flight 72. On October 7, 2008, 303 passengers and 12 crew members boarded Qantas Flight 72 at Singapore's Changi Airport. The aircraft for this flight was an Airbus A330, delivered new to Qantas on November 26, 2003. This large-capacity, wide-body, twin-engine aircraft is designed for medium to long-haul flights. In November 2004, it underwent an engine upgrade. This aircraft had a total of 20,000 operational hours. Flight 72 was scheduled to travel from Singapore to Perth, Australia, passing over the Indian Ocean. Typically, a direct flight from Singapore to Perth takes about 5 hours. At 1:25 a.m., the aircraft was pushed back from the gate. The pilots started the engines and began their taxi towards the runway, which they reached minutes later. In the aircraft's cockpit, the crew consisted of 3 pilots. Leading the crew was Captain Captain Sullivan, 53 years old, a former US Navy Top Gun pilot, known informally within Qantas as the shit magnet, due to his knack for encountering bad luck, including a previous engine blow-up. Captain Sullivan, with more than 13,000 flight hours, was joined by First Officer Peter Lipset, a former Royal Australian Navy helicopter pilot, who had logged nearly 12,000 flight hours. Also in the cockpit was Second Officer Hales, who provided additional support for the long journey to Perth and back, with 2,070 flying hours. After receiving clearance for takeoff, the captain pushed the thrust levers to takeoff thrust, initiating the takeoff roll. Just minutes after takeoff, the master caution alarm sounded. The first officer looked at the captain and started joking.
Here we go. Here it starts. I'm not sure if I should be flying with you, Kev, with your reputation.
In response, Captain Sullivan turned on the autopilot, as he had been manually flying the aircraft until that moment. By engaging the autopilot, they could focus on diagnosing the issue. The first officer cancelled the master caution, and they both turned their attention to the fault message displayed on the ECAM. The message they received read, "Air engine bleed 1 fault." When an issue like an engine bleed fault occurs, the ECAM does more than just alert the pilots. It provides step-by-step instructions on how to address the issue and reconfigure the aircraft. Within minutes, the first officer successfully resolved the problem, and the flight continued as planned. However, this was just the beginning of their troubles. True to his nickname, the shit magnet, the captain would experience even more challenges during this flight. While Flight 72 was cruising above the Indian Ocean at 37,000 feet, having just passed Indonesia, Captain Sullivan took a scheduled break. He moved to the crew rest area just outside the cockpit and started watching 2.5 men, unaware of the chaos that would soon unfold. During the captain's absence, the second officer oversaw the flight, and the next hour passed without any issues. At 4:33 a.m., Captain Sullivan returned to the cockpit. It was a beautiful day. They could see the Australian coastline looming in the distance. The captain asked the second officer to switch seats, taking back his position in the left seat while the second officer headed to the restroom. Shortly after the handover, the first officer left for his scheduled rest break, leaving the captain alone in the cockpit. 40 seconds later, the second officer returned from the restroom and joined the captain at the controls. As soon as he fastened his seatbelt, their horrifying journey began. Suddenly, one of the aircraft's 3 air data inertial reference units started supplying incorrect data to the flight computer. Soon after, the autopilot disconnected and the crew received numerous warnings and caution messages. As Captain Sullivan wrestled with the controls, he engaged the second autopilot. Seconds later, the chaos in the cockpit intensified as the master warning and master caution were joined by the simultaneous blaring of overspeed and stall warning alarms. The situation seemed impossible to the crew. The aircraft was warning them that it was flying both too fast and too slow at the same time. Amidst the warnings, none of the primary instruments provided clear information about the underlying issue, leaving the crew scrambling for answers. But the crew had barely any time to think when the following problem occurred. The airspeed and altitude readings on the captain's primary flight display began fluctuating unpredictably. This inconsistency cast doubt on the accuracy of the information displayed on the captain's primary flight display. To worsen the situation, the map that generally appeared on the captain's navigation display could not be shown due to a loss of heading information. Faced with multiple simultaneous issues, the crew became increasingly worried about the reliability of the aircraft's navigation and control systems. It appeared as though the flight computers had inexplicably malfunctioned. Captain Sullivan realized they were dealing with a problem known as unreliable airspeed. He disconnected the autopilot, not trusting it to safely control the aircraft without reliable speed and altitude data. Taking manual control, he tried to stabilize the aircraft at an altitude of 37,000 feet, using the side stick with his left hand and the thrust levers with his right. He relied on the standby instruments and the first officer's displays, which appeared to be functioning normally. The captain asked the second officer to call the first officer back to the flight deck to help them diagnose and manage the problems. While he was doing so, the aircraft abruptly pitched its nose down. Flight 72 was now in a deadly nosedive, a battle between the pilots and the aircraft's computers. While the pilots braced themselves, Captain Sullivan immediately applied back pressure on his side stick to counteract the pitch-down movement. However, the aircraft's flight control system did not respond to the captain's side stick inputs. He realized he was no longer in control of the aircraft, a terrifying realization. The captain neutralized the controls, hoping to regain some control over the aircraft, but this action did not alter its trajectory. They were still plunging towards the ocean. He then made minor adjustments on the side stick. This time, the aircraft responded normally, and he began to recover to the assigned altitude. The aircraft descended 690 feet in 23 seconds.
What the hell was that? It's the primary flight computer.
One of the aircraft's 3 air data inertial reference units began malfunctioning due to a fault within its central processing unit. As a result, incorrect and intermittent data was sent to the aircraft's flight control computers. These computers, which rely on accurate data for stability, received faulty angle of attack data from the malfunctioning units. The angle of attack is critical as it determines the aircraft's orientation against oncoming air, which is essential for maintaining lift and stability. The flight computers mistakenly believed that the aircraft was in a stall, a dangerous condition where the aircraft loses lift and could crash if not addressed quickly. The flight computers commanded the aircraft to pitch downward abruptly in response to what they perceived as an imminent stall. Due to the aircraft's flight envelope protection system, which prevents operation outside safe operational limits, the captain could not override this command. Despite attempts to issue pitch-up commands, the aircraft did not respond, significantly complicating efforts to stabilize the flight. Because of the sudden drop, the aircraft experienced a moment of weightlessness, causing anyone not secured by seatbelts to be thrown against the ceiling, resulting in injuries and damage to the overhead fittings. Because the pilots were uncertain if the malfunction could recur, the second officer promptly activated the seatbelt sign to on. Soon after, he made a public address announcement instructing all passengers and crew to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts immediately. After the aircraft returned to flight level 370, the flight crew initiated procedures to address multiple ECAM caution messages indicating various issues with the aircraft's systems. Despite the overwhelming number of alerts, the pilots maintained their focus, tackling each issue methodically. The second officer focused on resolving the fault messages, while Captain Sullivan continued to pilot the aircraft. After resolving several fault messages, the crew encountered the next one. The required action was to turn off Flight Control Primary Computer 3 and then turn it back on. The crew completed this action and cleared the message. However, as soon as they reset the FCPC 3, the aircraft commenced a second pitch-down movement, reaching a maximum pitch angle of approximately 3.5 degrees nose down. The captain acted swiftly, applying back pressure on his side stick to counteract the pitch-down movement. However, his initial action yielded no response similar to the first event. As the aircraft descended, his fighter pilot instincts kicked in. It was the second time he looked toward the Indian Ocean while gripping the unresponsive side stick, wondering, "Is this where it ends today?" The captain could see his own heart pounding through his shirt, a level of fear he had never experienced before, despite having flown the most dangerous missions and faced life-threatening dangers. After the nearly 400-foot drop over 16 seconds, the aircraft began to respond. Captain Sullivan delicately pulled the nose up. Aware that abrupt movements could lead to severe injuries among the passengers, the captain's input on the side stick was very gentle and calculated. As the captain guided the aircraft back to its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, the second officer reported a Prim 3 fault once again. However, this time, the captain instructed him not to touch it. At the same time, the captain noticed a concerning issue. The trim wheel wasn't functioning. They suspected the flight control system had switched to direct law, where all standard protections, such as angle of attack, overspeed, and bank angle protection, are absent. The pilots now had to manually trim the aircraft. The Airbus A330 incorporates a trimmable horizontal stabilizer, a specific movable section of the horizontal stabilizer that can be tilted up or down to adjust the aircraft's pitch. The trimmable horizontal stabilizer changes the pitch attitude without continuous pilot input, significantly reducing pilot workload and aiding in maintaining a steady flight path. Fortunately, the aircraft continued to function normally even without auto trim. The captain disconnected the auto thrust to minimize potential issues caused by the erroneous air data affecting the electronic engine control units. He then flew the aircraft manually, without an autopilot or auto thrust, relying solely on the standby instruments for the remainder of the flight. A $250 million aircraft reduced to the simplicity of a Cessna. Despite managing to keep the aircraft airborne, the master warning was firing off like a revolver, accompanied by constant ECAM messages. When a message appears on the ECAM, the pilots have time to act on it. However, these messages were fleeting, appearing and disappearing amid constant stall and overspeed warnings. These unrelenting oral alerts, which could not be silenced, significantly distracted them. Eventually, they turned into background noise, raising another concern. What if they missed a crucial warning? After a brief moment of calm, the captain publicly announced to the cabin, informing passengers that the crew was dealing with flight control issues and instructing everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. The first officer was not yet back in the cockpit after the second pitch down and was injured. Peter suspected he had broken his nose. Access to the cockpit could only be granted once conditions stabilized enough to perform the access procedure, which takes about 20 seconds. Given the extensive damage throughout the cabin, Peter also wondered whether the door could even open. After a few minutes, the first officer finally managed to return to the cockpit, taking over from the second officer in the right seat, while he moved to the third occupant's seat.
I can't let you guys alone for 2 minutes.
The crew discussed their situation, with the captain expressing his concerns about the possibility of another sudden pitch down, especially at a lower altitude. He worried about the flight computers possibly overriding his inputs again, rendering the aircraft uncontrollable and leading to a crash. The crew decided that they needed to land the aircraft as soon as possible. They were aware that Learmonth was relatively close and that it was a suitable destination for an A330 landing. Learmonth Airport, located near Exmouth in Western Australia, typically served air transport aircraft and was designated as an alternate airport for international flights. The airport featured a single sealed runway, 3,047 meters long and 45 meters wide, equipped with runway and approach lighting, a precision approach path indicator, and non-precision navigational aids. However, it lacked fire rescue services, a control tower, and airline services. Peter suggested declaring a mayday after witnessing the chaos in the cabin. The captain thought it wasn't necessary, but decided to declare a pan instead. There were many injuries, especially in the back of the aircraft, where the negative G-forces were more substantial. At 4:49 a.m., the first officer made a pan broadcast to air traffic control, stating that they had experienced flight control computer problems and that some of the aircraft's occupants had been injured. He requested clearance to divert and proceed directly to Learmonth. While the second officer attempted to communicate with the flight attendant at the aircraft's rear via the intercom, he discovered that the attendant was too injured to answer. Fortunately, 2 off-duty staff members on board responded. They reported multiple serious injuries, including spinal injuries and broken bones. Upon hearing this, the captain asked the first officer to declare a mayday. While organizing the diversion to Learmonth, the flight crew again reviewed what had happened, their current situation, and the ECAM messages. They noted that the NAV IR1 and FCTL Prim 3 fault messages and several other caution messages were still occurring. They concluded that the ECAM was not providing them with helpful information or recommended actions. Consequently, the first officer contacted the operator's maintenance watch unit located in Sydney via satellite communication system to brief them on the situation and seek assistance. But the help wasn't very helpful, and the captain told him to cancel the phone call. The maintenance watch advised the flight crew that Air Data Inertial Reference Unit 1 appeared to be common to the fault messages being displayed, but that there was also some conflicting information regarding elevator control. They provided no recommended actions at that stage. In a subsequent discussion, Maintenance Watch recommended that, at the crew's discretion, they could select Flight Control Primary Computer 3 to off. The crew discussed this recommendation and switched that computer off. This action did not affect the scrolling ECAM messages, stall warnings, or overspeed warnings. In addition to communicating with the maintenance watch, air traffic control, and the cabin, the flight crew worked together to provide the captain with all the information he needed to fly the aircraft. They also needed to manage a range of problems with aircraft systems. Due to fault messages associated with the Global Positioning System units, the flight crew could not enter an RNAV approach into the flight management computer. This added an extra challenge, as the crew was unsure how the aircraft would respond due to multiple system failures. The second officer had to manually control the cabin pressure during the descent because of a pressurization system fault. Due to an auto-brake fault, the crew also realized they would need to use manual braking for landing. To descend for landing, the captain executed wide left orbits to keep the aircraft's speed below 330 knots. He descended cautiously to avoid triggering another unexpected pitchdown event. Throughout this maneuver, he kept the runway in sight, as the lack of electronic maps meant he had to visually locate the airport for guidance. The crew completed the approach checklist and conducted a flight control check above 10,000 feet to test the aircraft's response, such as flaps. Uncertain of how the aircraft would react, they proceeded cautiously. After descending further, they positioned the aircraft about 28 kilometers away for a straight-in visual approach to runway 36. As the pilots prepared for landing, they faced significant challenges. Several systems were inoperative, and the aircraft's behavior was unpredictable. Moreover, another sudden pitch down at their current altitude could have fatal consequences. Fortunately, the landing gear extended without issue. The second officer armed the ground spoilers and deployed the third notch of flaps, preparing the aircraft for landing. These adjustments ensured that the aircraft was optimally configured for touchdown, enhancing stability and control as they approached the runway. The final moments were the most tense, with the potential for further complications. The atmosphere in the cockpit was charged, and silence pervaded the cabin. But finally, at 5:32 a.m., the aircraft successfully touched down at Learmonth, marking the end of a harrowing ordeal for everyone on board. Remarkably, stall and overspeed warnings continued to sound even after landing. Despite the violent maneuvers and the severity of injuries, miraculously, everyone on board survived. Out of the 315 people on board, 119 were injured, some seriously. In the hours that followed, the most severely injured passengers were airlifted to hospitals in Perth for urgent medical care. In conclusion, the pilot's ability to safely land the aircraft under such harrowing circumstances is truly commendable and prevented a potentially catastrophic disaster. However, the ordeal took a toll on the captain. Captain Sullivan documented his experience in a book, providing insight into the challenges faced during the flight and the crew's heroic efforts. Especially the moment after landing, when he walked through his aircraft to inspect the damage. He calls it the walk that changed his life. Ultimately, Sullivan made the difficult decision to retire from flying, influenced by the profound impact of the incident on his life and career. The impact of the incident was also significant for passengers and other crew members, even to this day.